Hi everyone. My name is Jenny, and I am the VP Education for the McGill Scientific Writing Initiative. Today we'll be talking a little bit about how to read and evaluate research articles. Um, this is something that this is a challenge often for people that are just starting in research and new students because academic writing is quite different from whatever you've encountered in high school or in, quite frankly, like your daily life. So in this presentation, I'm going to really uh, break down how to actually read them because it is quite challenging. The language is quite different, and it is basically like decoding a new um, type of work. And so, as I mentioned, I'm part of the McGill Scientific Writing Initiative, and I myself am and so I run these workshops along with the McGill Scientific Writing Initiative to help you learn how to write and disseminate your research, and to also help new scholars kind of break into academic research because it is quite challenging. And so we run a series of these webinars throughout the year, which we'll notify you about. And I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end. But today we'll focus on this. So I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach for this tutorial. And rather than focusing on PowerPoint slides, I do have a couple slides, but I'm going to actually go through a research article with you a little bit by bit, and we'll break down kind of some of the key questions to ask as you go, as you're reading the article. And so we won't really be using this PowerPoint, but for now, the purpose, I'll start with an introduction, which is really what a research article is. It's meant to communicate research findings, obviously, and to contribute to a body of knowledge in a specific field. And so the objectives of our presentation and workshop today is really to understand what the fundamental components of a research article are, how to read and evaluate them. Evaluation is an important aspect because just because it's published doesn't mean that it's high quality, and just because something is published doesn't mean that it is set knowledge. So it is important to be able to distinguish what are the gaps and what are things that could be improved on, so that you have something to research about yourself in the future. We'll also highlight some of the best practices and common pitfalls when it comes to reading and evaluating articles. And so in terms of the scope of this presentation, we're really going to focus on some of the key elements of peer-reviewed publications, but we're not covering any kind of like in-depth statistical analysis or data interpretation techniques. Like that's really reserved for your own field of study, and that's something that you'll learn on your own as time goes on, but is kind of beyond the scope of this starter tutorial. So a little bit of the agenda is that we'll quickly go through the components of a research article. Now, to note, we have another presentation on this last year on how to write a research article and what are the different components. So if you want a more detailed overview about what each of these components actually are, it's best to refer to that recording, which is on our website. We also have so I'll run through the tutorial with an actual research article. We'll talk about kind of how to organize your research and how to organize how you read the research, then some tips and common pitfalls. And in terms of the question and answer, we will do that in an online format. So these are the components of a research report. This is actually taken out of a previous slide that I had already done, where we did go into more detail about each of these components. Again, not doing that today, but just to showcase what are the parts that you're going to encounter. The first thing is the abstract, which is essentially a summary of the entire article. It's usually like 250 words, maybe 400, but it's quite short. The introduction, the methodology, the results, the discussion, and then conclusion. So these are pretty much the components you'll find in any sort of peer-reviewed research, and we'll go through each and what they mean. The introduction, for example, will usually set the context and why they're conducting the research, as well as the goal of the research. The methodologies, the methods they use. The results is what they found from their methodology. The discussion can vary depending on what kind of research it is and the purpose of the report, but essentially it discusses their finding in the context of the greater body of research that exists and whether or not their results were the same or different and what it means. And the conclusion is essentially the summary of what they found and what it means. The study that we'll be using today is one that I took for my field, and I picked it because it is a mixed method study, which means that it's using both qualitative and quantitative research. Now, I'm sure my research will be different from yours. Some of you might be doing more lab-based research, some of you may be doing more social sciences research, and so all of these research reports might look different. I tried to pick this one because it contains a little bit of both, but just to note that it's kind of impossible to cover every type of research report there is. So I'm going to try to make this as broad as possible. And you can always feel free to ask more specific questions if you email us. So this is the abstract. Essentially, an abstract, like I mentioned, is quite short. When you look at the abstract, this is the um, first and one of the most important parts of when you're reading research because it gives you such a high level overview. It's a really quick way to determine if it's actually relevant to your knowledge needs. This slide basically just shows you kind of how to identify the different parts of an abstract. Sometimes it's very structured where they tell you the introduction, the methods, the results, etc. And then sometimes it's unstructured, but you can essentially identify the different parts right away. So doing this will give you a pretty high level overview of what you're looking for and if you should actually read this article. That's quite important to save time. The point of reading research is really not about just reading research. It's about being able to identify what you need, when you need it, and if it's actually appropriate. Reading is a lot about also efficiency and effectiveness, not just reading for the sake of passive um, intake of information. So we'll start basically with this article, the use of virtual reality during medical procedures in a pediatric orthopedic setting, a mixed methods pilot feasibility study. It's already a lot of pretty big words, but essentially the study is investigating whether or not VR or virtual reality can help alleviate pain and anxiety, and whether or not clinicians and children actually like it when they used it in a children's bone hospital. And the reason they said it was mixed methods is because they're using qualitative and quantitative data to assess participants' points of view. And what pilot means is a pilot means basically like a test or starting research study. So it's not done with a huge population, but it's to kind of just test it. Let's see if it works. Feasibility pertains to whether or not it actually works. So that's what this article is investigating. So when you read the research article, obviously, you read the title, you determine if that's relevant to you, and then you look at the abstract. The abstract is quite important. It includes the purpose, methodology, key findings, and conclusions, and enables readers to quickly ascertain the report's purpose, relevance, and significance. So while I go through this article, I've kind of included all these like little notes so that you can kind of follow along with me instead of PowerPoint slides, because I think it kind of puts things into perspective a little bit more. Um, how I go about reading research reports is that in each section that I encounter, I ask myself a specific set of questions. These questions will help me note down what's important to take from the report and also where are any problems or things that the authors don't address. When you start with the abstract, the first question really is this relevant for my knowledge needs? If it's relevant to what you're actually trying to find out or you're curious about, you can go on to read the full report. Otherwise, you can quickly tell from an abstract whether or not it's important. Sometimes it's not, so you don't have to read it. Um, and yeah, so that's the abstract. The introduction, like I mentioned, really sets the stage for why the research was being conducted. In this particular study, they talk about how medical procedures induce a lot of pain and anxiety, and that it is quite important that we find ways to alleviate pain and anxiety because it leads to worse health outcomes. VR, in turn, has emerged as a good distraction tool because children are distracted while they're playing VR games. Um, so they wanted to see basically if VR works within children who have complex bone conditions. And so here they summarize the gap in research and then they present the study purpose. This is pretty typical in terms of how an introduction is presented. What is important for you to ask when you're reading this um, is Does it make sense why the author is conducting the study? Not all research reports are equal, and sometimes when they don't set the context properly, when they don't write the introduction very well, we don't really know why they're conducting it or what the problem is or what the research gap is. Um, so you need to ask yourself, like, does it make sense why the author is conducting the study? Is this something that I'm curious about? What is the research gap? And is the research gap clearly described with enough background information and supporting data slash previous research to justify why, I should spend time reading this report, but also why the authors conducted the study in the first place? Those are the key questions. And then we move on to the study purpose, which is does the aim of the study, does what the study set out to do actually help to fill in this gap in research or the research problem? So that's a big question too that you want to ask. And as I read a research article for the first time, I like to kind of make notes in the margin answering these with these questions in mind. So then we'll go on to the methods. The methods will it talks about, how they went about to setting out to solve their research problem or to fulfill the aims of their study. What you're really looking for when you read the methods is, do the authors justify their choices? And were the design choices, the choice of methodologies arbitrary? Like, did they kind of make it up and not say why or where these ideas came from? Um, or is it really based on previous research and findings and knowledge that was built in the field? Um, so this is really important, right? Because the methods that the authors use can bias the research quite heavily. So you want to make sure that the authors have kind of thought about what they're doing, why they're doing it, and if it aligns with their research aims. So this is really what you're looking for when you're reading it and when you're evaluating the article. So typically when you're reading it, you'll see the first thing they start with will be study design. Again, might be different in other fields, but usually it's study design. If you're in like the social sciences or healthcare fields or psychology, common ones will say that they were guided by a certain theoretical or methodological framework, which basically like a theory and a framework basically tells you kind of they're created by other authors or researchers in the past, and it gives you a solid basis to conduct your research on. So like, why am I conducting this research? What might I expect to see, et cetera, et cetera. In other fields, this might be like a certain hypothesis or like certain standard of findings or doing things. So in this article, they don't have a hypothesis because it's a different area of study, but you might see that as well. So yeah, for this study, they're guided by these best practice recommendations. And in other research, you'll find they'll probably be guided by some sort of recommendation, previous hypotheses, or previous findings. At this point, you need to know why the author chose their specific methodology and if it makes sense for their research aims. So here you can see, just note if their choices were actually informed by pre-existing theories or frameworks. Sometimes it's not, and that might be that might be a problem later on. Um, Depending on your area of study, they may or may not use human participants. In this study, obviously they did. So if they're using human participants, you need to look at whether or not um, sampling was done in a biased or non-biased way and what kind of techniques they used. Same thing if they weren't using human participants, you need to kind of look at how they selected the tools that they were going to use for their research and if it will cause biases or problems in the research. So in this study, for example, they used convenience sampling to recruit children and adolescents. They explained what their inclusion criteria were and why they chose a specific sample size. So that's quite, I'm gonna make this a little bigger, sorry. So that's quite important because they're justifying their choices. And at this point, you can make notes in the margins again about, any problems that you see, anything that they don't justify, et cetera, et cetera. We'll move on to study procedures and data collection. So this is usually a section where they outline exactly what they did, the order that they did it in, and what tools they used to collect data. So For example, you're going to need to ask questions about the timing of interventions or when they chose to evaluate findings, auditing, and what kind of data was collected. So for one that involves like human participants where they're enacting some sort of test or doing or having participants go through something, you need to ask, does the timing of the evaluations make sense to find out what they actually want to find out? Are the instruments that they use to test the outcomes appropriate, and are there biases in how the data is collected? So for this study, for example, they collected some baseline patient-reported data before they used the VR, then they used the VR, and then they collected it after. So that can kind of tell you that they actually have a baseline point to compare to. And this is important because actually not all studies do a baseline comparison. Um, yeah, so it's just important to note that, like, again, for this one, this is not a randomized control trial, which means that they don't have a group that didn't undergo any kind of intervention to compare to. So that might be something that weakens their findings a little bit, but they do specify that this isn't meant to be a randomized control trial. Again, in your field of study, this might look different. So just to note kind of what's missing and why they did certain things is really important. Here they outline all their instruments, what they used. Um, I think what's important here, really, when they're outlining kind of all the different tools that they use to collect data, is what the instruments are or what the tools are. So one of the strengths of this mixed method study is that they're using multiple forms of data like interviews, survey, observations, etc., which means that you have multiple streams of kind of, I guess, quote unquote, proof coming in of your findings. Um, but just to note that more data doesn't always mean better. You need to ask yourself if the data they're collecting actually is appropriate and aligns with their research aims. So, for example, maybe one author uses less data collection tools, but they're using very known or standardized instruments that are known to capture like certain perspectives or like certain findings versus another author is using a lot of different tools, but none of them are really validated or well known or are developed simply like arbitrarily. The former is probably going to be a stronger and more convincing than the latter. So it's kind of a balance between what you're collecting, why you're collecting it, and what tools you're using, and making sure that they're trustworthy and that they're valid and reliable. So these are the questions I would ask while you're going through the methods section. You need to look at basically every section and always go back to the aims that the authors specified at the beginning and ask yourself if they actually align and if you think um, that the way that they're going about investigating their intended purpose um, will actually yield the results that they need, or if it's maybe testing for something else. Okay. So now we'll go on to data analysis. So we're still in the method section. This is again your most important section when you're reading and evaluating a research article. Um, I won't go too deep into the data analysis because the way that data should or can be analyzed is very field dependent. It'll change if you're in psychology versus wet labs. And I don't know wet labs as well, right? So I'm not going to go too far into this, but just check to see what other authors in your field have done and how they've analyzed data. It'll give you a good idea of kind of why they chose certain data analysis methods. Um, this is also something if you have a research supervisor, you can talk to them about, but basically, it's the same principle. You need to see how that aligns with accepted standards, or if they're using a novel method of data analysis, just question whether or not it aligns with their intended purposes and if it's actually a good way to analyze the data. Okay, now we're going to move on to the results. Um, For this article, I'm not going to delve too deeply into results. You can see that because they collected so many different kinds of data, the results section is quite long and they had quite a bit of research questions. The authors in this particular study did a good job of answering all the questions quite comprehensively. So I won't have the time to go through every little part of this, and I don't think it will be relevant to you, but just for the results, it's important to double check whether the authors presented the findings in a way that aligns with their aims. I know I've said that a bunch of times, but it always goes back to their research aims and whether or not they actually leveraged kind of all their data collection tools and use the data and then presented them. So that the way they present their data is quite important, because it'll help the readers interpret. So a badly written research article, which happens, will often um, present data in an overly simplistic way, or they'll fail to present certain data, or they'll do, for example, extensive data analysis techniques just to kind of um, just to say that like, oh, we found something significant, but actually they're just doing tests over and over again, and it might just be a result of chance. That's called, there's a term for it that's called p-hacking, and you might learn more about it in your specific research classes. But um, I think a good kind of question to stick by is that does the findings that they present actually seem realistic? Does it make sense? And does it actually align with their research aims? And then are they using all the tools at their disposal and then presenting the data accordingly? And so tables are a good way to do this, but it's all field dependent. And depends on whether you're doing quantitative or qualitative research. Okay, so now we're going to go into the discussion. Once you've read through the results, the discussion is also another important part because in the discussion, the authors really pull together all their findings and talk about what it means in the context of other research and what it means for their specific research aims. Here, they'll usually present supporting research or research that diverges from their findings. Um, and you need to ask yourself here, like, when the authors are presenting their findings, are they making their findings bigger than they should be? So, for example, if they found a slight decrease in pain, are they saying suddenly that like virtual reality is the answer to eliminating pain? Because that's not realistic. So just make sure here that you're looking at whether or not the authors are being realistic about their finding and being truthful. Um, and look at their also like when they're presenting their discussion, look at the other sources that they cite and the number of sources, right? Because here in this particular article, they found that that virtual reality did quite well at the study site, and they were able to present a lot of evidence. But they were also sure to present results that were contrary because that inevitably happens and they try to explain it. So it's just really important to see how the author navigates kind of conflicting results, but also results that agree with their findings and what it means. That's really the main thing that I'm going to look for and of course, like if they're realistic about what their findings actually mean. So the parts that I highlighted here, this is, them kind of writing about those things consistent with other studies. VR was clinically useful. All stakeholders deemed it acceptable, and then they present a bunch of findings. So that's just an example there. Again, this section changes depending on kind of your field and what it calls for. Like for clinical research, you do tend to have sections on clinical implications, recommendations, but this might not be in all research. What I really like to talk about is the strength and limitation section. This is something that's common to all studies, but not all authors write very well. So strengths are, of course, what are the things that are unique about the study? So the author here talks about how they used mixed method studies, which allowed for a comprehensive description of the implementation of this tool in their clinical setting. But also, like some authors will not um, mention the limitations or the shortcomings of their study. Every study has shortcomings. There's not a single study out there that covers every single population, that covers every single point there is to cover. There will always be shortcomings. So look at how the author actually addresses them, because whether or not they address them tells you if they're even aware and if their research is trustworthy. And if they do, it tells you kind of whether or not they're being realistic about their findings. So it gives you more information about the quality of the paper. The conclusion is it's the end of the article. So typically this is just one paragraph and it will summarize what they found. Um, and just in terms of, and so that's the whole article, but in terms of some smaller kind of tips and tricks, when you're looking at the discussion, when you're looking at the introduction, take note of who the author cites. So these are the references here. Take a look at like, who are the authors that the current researchers are relying on, because sometimes authors will like cite their own work a lot. Um, and that's pretty biasing, quite frankly, because it's only one person's work. And then, so you need to look at whether or not they're actually drawing from enough of whether or not they're aware of what's actually in the literature, or if they're only basing it on their own work and point of view. Look at also like when these papers were published. So this article is citing at least, you know, it seems to be citing like current literature. This one's a little old, but um, look at if they're citing like literature from like the 90s versus like current literature, because it tells you kind of whether or not their information that they present is reliable. Okay, so I'm going to just exit and I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second. Okay, so going back to our agenda, some common like tips is that when it comes to reading research articles, again, like really read the abstract. You don't need to read everything. And even then, like once you learn to identify these different parts of the research articles and what you're looking for, sometimes you don't need to read the whole thing. So if I'm doing like a literature review on a specific topic, you're going to become more familiar. And as you begin to read faster, you might not need to read like every single word. But when you start out, it is good practice to annotate, to read it thoroughly, to take the time to get to know your area of research. And then as you become more familiar, you're going to be able to kind of skim. But if you start out trying to skim, you're definitely not going to get the information or the necessary knowledge that you need to be able to read faster. Common pitfalls that I've seen are people that are trying to read everything. That's impossible. Um, Pick what's really relevant. Like what I tend to do is that if I have a certain research question, I break it down into its main components. So if my research question is how does VR impact children's anxiety in the hospital, I will look at, virtual reality in child healthcare. Then I'll look at things that alleviate children's anxiety. So like I'll pick major kind of subjects and then look into those. And as I learn more, I will narrow down what I read. And just another note, I was trying to, keep this short so we have time for question and answers, but since we're doing that online, it can take a little bit more time. I'm going to just pull up a way that I organize my literature. So when you're reading a bunch of research articles all the time, it's inevitable that, you're going to have to find a good way to organize it. Now, this is really person dependent. So some people like to take individual notes after reading each paper. Some people like to use software. I am kind of old-fashioned and like to use uh, Microsoft Excel. So I'll show you kind of how I begin to organize my readings and take notes um, as I am reading. Okay, so this is my Excel sheet. This is for this was for a specific class that I was taking, but essentially, like I organize all my research articles into this Excel with headings. So, like you have the author, article title, study aims, and I have study design. So I organize all like parts of the study that I'm interested in learning about. So study tools, observations, etc., into this Excel and then write my notes in there. And as I go, I begin to organize it, kind of put things, under themes, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a very personal way of doing it. But I do suggest that once you start getting an idea of your literature, like start organizing it, figuring out a way to take notes, but not in a way where everything kind of feels separate, like try to keep it together and make links. But that's really personal. I don't know if anybody else from my group have like other ways that they like to do it, but this is really how I organize my notes. And so yeah, that's the presentation today. If you have any questions, you can always email us. Maybe if somebody from my can we put the website in the chat? I wonder if it'll show. Yeah, hopefully that's recorded. So I'm going to yeah, I'm going to say it out loud and share my screen just in case this chat isn't showing. Um, okay, so we have a couple outlets as you can see. If you want to email us, you can go to mcgill.swi@gmail.com. That's our email. We are also on Instagram as McGill SWI on Instagram. We also have our website. So there's a couple ways that you can reach us, but on Instagram is a good way. We're pretty active there. And of course, the email we check as well. And so it's also important to note that we do put all our presentations up and they are recorded, and you can access like previous year's presentation too. I think we did one on we did one on the different components of a research report. So if you're totally new to it and want a more detailed overview of what's actually in each part of this paper, I would strongly suggest you watch that presentation. There's one on how to conduct like a literature review as well, and then we have upcoming workshops as well with some McGill staff and the McGill Writing Center, which we're organizing right now, and they're a great resource to help you actually begin to write. The first component of writing and of conducting research is reading. Um, so this is important if it's new to you. And yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.